Well, we've been working our way through the minor prophet Habakkuk under the theme, Pray Yet. And we've seen Habakkuk's first complaint in chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, where he kind of says, God, hello, are you paying attention to the rampant evil that's going on all around us? And we've also seen God's response to that complaint in chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, which basically says, hey, I've got this. Habakkuk, you don't need to worry. I've got a plan, and this plan is to judge my people with Babylon. But that creates all kind of problems for Habakkuk because he knows that Babylon is worse than Israel. And he just comes unglued. He blows a gasket. He knows that Judah might be bad, but after all, Babylon? Really, God? Are you sure? It'd be similar to us saying, let's let Sin City punish, Mayberry with Andy and Barney. It just wouldn't seem to make much sense. And this is the part of the book that I imagine Habakkuk is saying to God, say what? First it was, hello, are you paying attention? And God was saying, nuh-uh, I am paying attention, and I'm going to raise up Babylon to take care of this. And then it's like, did you say Babylon? Say what? So let me read this passage for us, and then we might just kind of go down through it verse by verse. This is chapter 1, verse 12 of ESV. Are you not from everlasting? Habakkuk is saying to God. O Lord, my God, my Holy One, the Hebrew word kadosh, set apart, dedicated, separate, different than mankind. We shall not die. O Lord, you've ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. So he's coming to recognize this, but struggling. Verse 13 is a real key. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? So Habakkuk is really giving an emotional complaint here, isn't he? Verse 14, you make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his drag net. So he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his drag net. For by them he lives in luxury and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Then chapter 2, verse 1, because probably the chapter division should go after verse 1, not before it. I will take my stand at my watchpost, says the prophet, and station myself on the tower, and look out to see what he will say to me, and what I will answer concerning my complaint. In other words, Habakkuk is willing to kind of step up to the plate and say, okay, God, if this is your way, I'm going to stand on the watchtower, and I'm going to see it play out. Well, he's going to shudder with what's going to happen. So let me walk down through this kind of verse by verse. I'll cluster a few verses together because they belong together. But in verse 12, Habakkuk is going to be respectful to God as he questions God. Now that's very important for us to realize. It is disingenuous and disrespectful to argue with God and not reverence him at the same time. Job had to learn that. Habakkuk shows evidence of it. If you're going to question God, don't call him the daddy upstairs. Don't call him a child abuser because he allowed his son to die. No, we always come with sandals off, realizing when you're in the presence of God, you're on holy ground. So he questions God, which is okay. God's not going to get dethroned because we have a few questions to ask him. He acknowledges that God is three things: eternal, he's holy, and he is a rock. So his angst is really this. If God is eternal, if God is holy, if God is a rock, how will he use such a terrible nation as Babylon? Which brings us to verse 13. So in case God has forgotten how wicked Babylon really is, Habakkuk takes it upon himself, do we ever do this? To remind God how wicked they are in relation to a holy God. Now, there's an awful lot in the Bible about reminding and remembering. But really, you don't have to remind an omniscient God of anything. Habakkuk kind of takes it upon himself to remind God of his own holy character. God's eyes are pure. Well, amen. God can't tolerate sin. Amen. God can't even look at evil. True. God's normal MO is not to sit idle and watch evil go forward. He usually steps in and does something about it, of course. God is not in the habit of remaining silent when the righteous are being swallowed up. We might also want to note here that Habakkuk seems to be tipping his hand to note that God is willing to allow even his holy remnant of his people, through whom the Messiah will come, to maybe experience some judgment with the prospect of maybe purifying them. Now, that's not very clear. It's just kind of alluded to. It's just kind of maybe suggested, but there's a little hint that maybe the prophet in his prayer closet is beginning to see things from God's point of view. Well, when we come to verses 14, 15, 16, and 17, we can kind of cluster them together because they deal with this idea of fishing. Habakkuk acknowledges in these verses that he knows how vicious Babylon is. That's what gives credence to the theme, say what? You're going to punish us with Babylon? God, they're so vicious. And the metaphor he chooses to draw upon is that of fishing. Now, what's the connection with fishing? Why would fishing have to do with the wickedness of Babylon? Well, it might not be so removed from our world as we think. For instance, these days, we spell fishing a little different, don't we? It's spelled Phishing. And of course, that has to do with cyber scams in cyberspace. It's a world of computers that we're talking about here, where somebody can steal your information. Babylon had a river that ran right through the town. And so they obviously caught fish for their meat source. And fishing would be a ready metaphor to talk about Babylon. In fact, a little interesting historical background here. Habakkuk's world, archaeologists have uncovered whole monuments that show fishing hooks in human lips. Is the fishing hook the Babylonians and the human lips some conquered people of theirs? It is the symbol of Babylon, fishing. The idea is that if Babylon hooks you, you won't be able to escape. You mean God allows Babylon to exercise their seeming free will over people by hooking them. That would seem to be the imagery of verses 14, 15, 16, and 17. God makes humankind, sometimes when he's judging them, like fish. They swim around as if they're masters of their own destiny. Crawling things crawl around as if they can rule themselves. But that could not be farther from the truth. God is not into some kind of catch and release business. God catches and uses them for his own purposes. It's not the Babylonians who hook people. God hooks them, puts them in his net, and seems justified in how he wants to use them. We come then to chapter 2, verse 1. And Habakkuk is not sure what to do with this. But he decides to stand and watch the ways of God sort of play out. For one thing, he wants to know how to answer God more fully. So I think from this section, we kind of learn two lessons, two things. Number one, that God is amazingly consistent in character. He cannot stand in the presence of sin. And that part, Habakkuk has exactly correct. So Babylon's sins are not of no account to God. They are. But while he's amazingly consistent in character, God is incredibly patient. He can allow evil to go on for years, for decades, yes, and even centuries. I mean, think back to Jonah and Nahum. Jonah's preaching saved Nineveh from the judgment of God for 100 years. But finally, Nahum came along and pronounced it to be final. So, years, decades, even centuries, and God will even use the worst of situations to accomplish his purpose. So, even though Habakkuk is voicing his complaint, saying, "What? You're going to use Babylon?" He does so in his prayer closet very respectfully. And already we're beginning to see the movement in his own heart to watch what God will do.